Annie Keene's hands were bleeding through her gloves as she stumbled through the final mile of blinding snow, clutching a small medical bag that contained the only thing standing between a 10-year-old boy and death. She had no idea that the child's uncle was watching her every step through security cameras, or that he controlled a billion-dollar empire from his mountain fortress just 20 miles away. She couldn't have known that her 12-mile journey through the worst blizzard in decades would bring the most powerful man in biotechnology to her doorstep with an offer that would change everything. But first, she had to survive the night. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Annie Keene checked her watch for the 15th time in the past hour. The digital display read 11:47 p.m., and the numbers glowed eerily against the whiteout conditions surrounding Pine Ridge Medical Clinic. What had started as a typical evening shift had transformed into something far more desperate when the call came in about young Marcus Chin, the 10-year-old boy whose fever had spiked to dangerous levels just as the season's worst blizzard descended upon their remote mountain town. Annie had been a registered nurse for 8 years, working in this small clinic that served the scattered communities nestled in the Colorado Rockies. She had seen her share of medical emergencies, but tonight felt different. The boy needed a specific antibiotic that they had run out of earlier that week, and the nearest hospital was 40 miles away through treacherous mountain roads that were now completely impassable. The snowplows had given up hours ago, and even the emergency vehicles were stranded until the storm passed. "The roads are completely blocked," Dr. Patterson had told her over the crackling radio connection. "We've got reports of multiple avalanches on Route 16, and the State Patrol is advising everyone to shelter in place until morning." He paused, and Annie could hear the frustration in his voice. "I'm sorry, Annie. There's nothing more we can do tonight." But Annie couldn't accept that. She stared out the window at the swirling snow and thought about Marcus, whose worried grandmother had called 3 times in the past hour. The boy lived with his elderly grandmother in a small cabin about 12 miles up the mountain, accessible only by a winding dirt road that would be impossible to navigate by vehicle in these conditions. His parents had died in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving him in the care of his grandmother, Rosa Chen, who had been beside herself with worry when she called the clinic. "Please, Miss Annie," Rosa had pleaded over the phone, her voice thick with her accent and tears. "His fever, it won't break. He's burning up, and he keeps asking for his mama. I don't know what to do." Annie had checked the clinic's medical supplies again, hoping against hope that she had missed something. But the antibiotic Marcus needed, amoxicillin with clavulanic acid, was definitely gone. They had used the last of it on another patient earlier in the week and hadn't received their scheduled delivery due to supply chain issues. The nearest pharmacy was in the same town as the hospital, 40 miles of impossible terrain away. She pulled out her phone and tried calling the emergency services again, but the call went straight to a busy signal. The cell towers were likely affected by the storm, and even if she could get through, she knew what they would tell her. Wait until morning. Hope for the best. But morning might be too late for Marcus. Annie thought about the hiking trails she knew so well from her weekend adventures. There was an old mining trail that cut through the forest, reducing the distance to Marcus's cabin to about 12 miles if she traveled on foot. It would be dangerous, maybe even suicidal in these conditions, but it was possible. She had grown up in these mountains, had hiked every trail since she was a child. Her father had been a park ranger, and he had taught her how to navigate by landmarks, even in poor visibility. The decision crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. She gathered the necessary supplies, the antibiotic from her personal emergency kit that she kept for camping trips, along with fever reducers and oral rehydration salts. She layered on every piece of winter gear she had in her locker, including the heavy-duty snow boots she always kept at the clinic. Her headlamp, compass, and GPS device went into her backpack, along with emergency food and water. As she prepared to leave, Annie left a note for Dr. Patterson explaining her plan. She knew he would be furious when he found it in the morning, but she couldn't bear the thought of a child dying when she had the means to help him. The Hippocratic Oath talked about doing no harm, but sometimes doing nothing was the greatest harm of all. The moment she stepped outside, the full force of the blizzard hit her like a physical blow. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her backward, and the snow was falling so heavily that she could barely see 5 feet ahead. The temperature had dropped well below zero, and her breath formed instant clouds that were immediately whisked away by the gale. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. This was madness. She could die out here, and then she would be no help to Marcus at all. But then she thought of Rosa's voice on the phone, the desperate love of a grandmother who had already lost so much. Annie adjusted her backpack, pulled her wool hat down over her ears, and stepped into the storm. The first mile was deceptively manageable. She knew the terrain well, following the main road until she reached the trailhead that would take her up into the mountains. Her headlamp cut through the swirling snow, creating a small cone of visibility that she followed step by step. The snow was already knee-deep in places, and each step required significant effort as she broke through the crust that had formed on top. By the second mile, Annie began to understand the true challenge ahead of her. The trail had become completely obscured by snow, and she was navigating purely by compass and her knowledge of the mountain's contours. The wind was relentless, driving snow into her face despite her protective goggles and making every breath a struggle. Her fingers were already growing numb inside her insulated gloves, and she could feel moisture collecting inside her boots as the snow found its way past her gaiters. She forced herself to maintain a steady pace, knowing that stopping for too long could be fatal in these conditions. The trail climbed steadily upward, and her leg muscles burned with the effort of lifting her feet through the deep snow. Several times, she stumbled over hidden rocks or fallen branches, catching herself just before she could fall face first into the drifts. As she climbed higher, Annie's thoughts turned to Marcus. She had treated him before for minor injuries and illnesses, and she remembered him as a bright, curious boy who was still processing the loss of his parents. He loved to draw pictures of airplanes, and had told her once that he wanted to be a pilot when he grew up, so he could visit his parents in heaven. The memory strengthened her resolve and helped her push through the burning sensation in her lungs as the thin mountain air combined with her exertion. By the 4th mile, the trail had become even more treacherous. She was now following an old mining road that wound around the mountainside, with steep drops on one side and vertical rock faces on the other. The snow had drifted in strange patterns here, sometimes barely covering the ground, and sometimes piled up to her waist. She had to constantly adjust her route, sometimes climbing over fallen trees that had been brought down by the weight of the snow. The cold was becoming a serious concern. Despite her layers of clothing, Annie could feel her body heat leaching away. Her core temperature was dropping, and she recognized the early signs of hypothermia. The slight confusion, the way her movements were becoming less coordinated, the overwhelming urge to just sit down and rest. She forced herself to keep moving, doing jumping jacks every few hundred yards to get her blood flowing again. Halfway through her journey, disaster nearly struck. As she rounded a bend in the trail, her foot broke through what she thought was solid ground. She plunged through a thin layer of snow and ice into a creek bed, the shockingly cold water immediately soaking through her boot and sock. For a moment, panic seized her. Wet feet in these temperatures could mean frostbite or worse. She scrambled out of the creek and found a sheltered spot behind a large boulder where she could assess the damage. Her right foot was soaked and already growing numb. She had brought spare socks, anticipating something like this might happen, but changing them in these conditions would be extremely difficult. She found a relatively dry spot and quickly removed her boot and wet sock, her fingers fumbling with the laces as the cold made her movements clumsy. The spare sock went on quickly, followed by a chemical hand warmer that she pressed against her foot before putting her boot back on. The whole process took less than 3 minutes, but by the time she was done, she was shivering violently. The next few miles passed in a blur of determination and growing exhaustion. Annie's internal dialogue had shifted from optimistic encouragement to simple commands. Lift your left foot, now your right foot. Breathe. Keep the compass heading northeast. Don't stop moving. The landscape around her had become an alien world of white and shadow, with familiar landmarks completely transformed by the accumulating snow. She began to hallucinate around the 8th mile, a common symptom of hypothermia and exhaustion. She thought she heard voices calling her name, saw lights that weren't there, Imagined that her father was walking beside her, encouraging her forward, just as he had when she was a child, struggling to keep up on family hiking trips. "One foot in front of the other, Annie girl," she heard him saying. "The mountain will test you, but it will also teach you what you're really made of." The hallucinations were both comforting and terrifying. Annie knew they were a sign that her body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve core heat and energy. She forced herself to eat one of the energy bars she had brought. Though her jaw muscles were so cold that chewing was difficult, the calories provided a small boost, but she could feel her energy reserves depleting with each step. By the 10th mile, Annie was moving more slowly, but she could sense that she was getting close to her destination. The terrain was becoming familiar again, and she recognized the distinctive outline of a rock formation that she had climbed many times as a child. Marcus's cabin was just over the next ridge, down in a small valley that provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. But those last 2 miles were the hardest of all. The snow was deeper here, accumulated in the valley where the wind had deposited it throughout the storm. Each step sank her nearly to her hips, and she had to use her hands to help pull herself forward. Her headlamp battery was beginning to fade, adding another layer of urgency to her situation. If the light failed completely, she would be navigating in total darkness. She could smell wood smoke before she could see the cabin, that distinctive scent of burning pine that meant warmth and safety. The smell gave her a final burst of energy, and she pushed through the last 100 yards with renewed determination. Through the swirling snow, she could see the warm yellow glow of windows, and she had never been so grateful to see electric lights in her life. Rosa Chen answered the door, before Annie could even knock, as if she had been watching for her through the window. The elderly woman's eyes were wide with disbelief as she took in Annie's snow-covered form, the icicles hanging from her hat, the way she swayed with exhaustion. "Miss Annie? How did you get here? The roads, they are impossible," Rosa exclaimed, pulling her inside and immediately beginning to help her remove her frozen outer layers. Annie's voice was hoarse from breathing the cold air, barely above a whisper. "I walked. I have medicine for Marcus. How is he?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "Still very sick. His fever, it came back even worse. I was so scared, I didn't know what to do. But you came. You walked through the storm for my boy." Annie nodded, her hands shaking as she fumbled in her backpack for the medical supplies. "Let me see him." Marcus was lying on the couch in the living room, bundled in blankets but still shivering with fever. His face was flushed, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. Annie's professional instincts took over despite her exhaustion, and she quickly took his vital signs. His temperature was 104.2 degrees, dangerously high, but not yet at the point where permanent damage would occur. "This is going to help," she told Rosa, as she prepared the antibiotic injection. "The fever should start coming down within a few hours." As she administered the medicine, Marcus opened his eyes and looked at her with confusion. "Miss Annie? Why are you here? Are you visiting like before?" Annie smiled despite her exhaustion. "I brought you some medicine to help you feel better. You're going to be okay." The boy nodded weakly and closed his eyes again. Rosa hovered nearby, wringing her hands with worry, but also with profound gratitude. "You risked your life for him," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you. Taking care of people is why I became a nurse," Annie replied, though the words came out slurred with fatigue. "But right now, I think I need to warm up before I can make the trip back." Rosa looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "You cannot go back tonight. Look at yourself. You can barely stand. You will stay here until the storm passes and the roads are cleared." Annie wanted to argue, but her body was making the decision for her. The warmth of the cabin was making her realize just how close she had come to serious hypothermia. Her hands were still shaking, and she could barely feel her feet despite the chemical warmers. Rosa guided her to a chair near the fireplace and brought her hot coffee and warm blankets. As Annie sat by the fire, slowly warming up and watching Marcus sleep peacefully, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The antibiotics were already beginning to work, and she could see that his breathing was becoming less labored. The risk had been worth it. She dozed fitfully in the chair, waking periodically to check on Marcus and take his temperature. What Annie didn't know was that her journey through the storm had not gone unnoticed. High-tech security cameras, virtually invisible and weather-resistant, had tracked her progress along several points of her route. The cameras were part of an extensive surveillance system that monitored the entire mountain region, installed and maintained by someone who valued privacy above almost everything else. 20 miles away, in a modernist glass and steel structure that seemed to defy the laws of physics as it clung to the mountainside, Dr. Victor Chen sat in his control room, watching the final footage of Annie's arrival at the cabin. He had been following her journey for hours, initially with curiosity, and then with growing amazement. The woman on his screens had risked her life to save a child she barely knew, walking 12 miles through conditions that would have killed most people. Victor Chen was one of the wealthiest and most reclusive men in America. As the CEO and founder of Biogenesis Technologies, he had revolutionized the field of personalized medicine and gene therapy. His company's innovations had saved millions of lives and generated billions in revenue, but Victor himself had not appeared in public for over 5 years. He conducted all his business remotely from his mountain compound, a state-of-the-art facility that served as both his home and his primary research laboratory. Few people knew that Victor had any personal connections to the area. Marcus was the son of Victor's younger sister, Elena, who had died in a car accident along with her husband 2 years earlier. Victor had been estranged from his family for years, buried in his work and his quest for scientific breakthroughs. He had provided financial support for Marcus and Rosa from a distance, ensuring they had everything they needed, but he had never visited or made direct contact. The guilt of his absence had eaten at him for months. He told himself that he was too busy, that his work was too important, that a 10-year-old boy wouldn't understand the complexities of running a multinational corporation. But watching Annie risk everything for his nephew forced Victor to confront the truth about his priorities and his failures as a family member. He had been monitoring the police and emergency services communications all evening, waiting for news that someone would attempt to rescue. When the official response had been to wait until morning, Victor had considered sending his own private helicopter, but even his state-of-the-art aircraft couldn't fly safely in the blizzard conditions. He had resigned himself to hoping that Marcus could hold on until the storm passed. Then this nurse, this woman he had never met, had done what no one else was willing to do. She had walked 12 miles through a blizzard, risking hypothermia, frostbite, and death to save a child. Victor replayed the footage of her journey, studying her determination, her refusal to give up even when she stumbled and fell, her pure selflessness in the face of mortal danger. As the night wore on, and the storm began to subside, Victor made a series of phone calls. He contacted his head of security to get a complete background report on Annie Keene. He spoke with his chief of staff about clearing his schedule for the following day. Most importantly, he called his personal attorney and had him draw up a very specific type of contract, one that would change Annie's life as dramatically as she had changed his perspective on what it meant to truly care blah. For others, the morning sun revealed a transformed landscape. The blizzard had moved on, leaving behind nearly 3 feet of fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the bright mountain light. Annie woke to the sound of snowplows working on the main road, a distant rumble that promised the return of normal transportation and communication. Marcus's fever had broken completely during the night, and he was sitting up eating breakfast when Annie checked on him. His eyes were bright and clear, and he managed a weak smile when he saw her. "Miss Annie, Grandma Rosa told me you walked here in the big snow. That's really far." "It wasn't too bad," Annie lied, ruffling his hair. "I'm just glad you're feeling better." Rosa had prepared a huge breakfast, insisting that Annie needed to regain her strength before attempting the journey back to town. As they ate, they could hear the distant sound of heavy machinery working to clear the mountain roads. It would still be several hours before normal vehicle traffic could resume, but the worst was over. Annie was finishing her second cup of coffee when she heard an unfamiliar sound outside, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors. Rosa looked out the window with confusion, and Marcus pressed his face against the glass with excitement. "It's a helicopter, Miss Annie. Look how big it is." The aircraft that landed in the small clearing near the cabin was not a typical emergency or news helicopter. It was a sleek, expensive-looking machine painted in dark blue with no visible markings. Annie watched through the window, as a man in an expensive-looking winter coat emerged from the helicopter and walked purposefully toward the cabin. Rosa opened the door before he could knock, and Annie was surprised to see the family resemblance immediately. The man had the same bone structure as Marcus, the same dark eyes and high cheekbones. He was perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Hello, Rosa," he said quietly. "May I come in?" Rosa's hand went to her heart, and she stared at the man as if seeing a ghost. "Victor? Is it really you?" Annie realized she was witnessing a family reunion of sorts, but the tension in the room was palpable. Marcus looked between the adults with confusion, not recognizing his uncle, who had been absent from his life for so long. Victor Chen entered the cabin and immediately focused on Marcus, kneeling down to the boy's level. "Hello, Marcus. I'm your Uncle Victor. I know you don't remember me, but I've been thinking about you a lot lately." Marcus studied his uncle's face with the serious expression that children sometimes get when meeting new adults. "Are you my mom's brother? She had a picture of you, but you look different." "Yes, I'm your mother's brother, and I'm very sorry that I haven't been here to visit you." Victor's voice was thick with emotion. "I've made some mistakes, but I want to fix them now, if you'll let me." Annie felt like she was intruding on a private family moment, but Victor turned to her before she could excuse herself. "And you must be Annie Keene. I need to talk to you." Annie was surprised that he knew her name, but she nodded. "I should probably head back to town soon. The roads will be passable in a few hours, and I need to get back to the clinic. Actually, that's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you." Victor stood up and looked directly at her with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable. "I've been watching the news reports about your walk through the storm. The whole state is talking about the nurse who risked her life to save a patient." Annie frowned. "I haven't seen any news reports." Rosa turned on her small television and flipped to a local news channel. Sure enough, there was a story about Annie's trek through the blizzard, with reporters calling it a heroic act of selflessness. Somehow, word had gotten out about her journey, and the story was being picked up by national outlets. "I don't understand," Annie said, feeling overwhelmed. "I was just doing my job." Victor smiled for the first time since arriving. "That's exactly why I need to talk to you. What you did last night went far beyond your job description. You risked your life for a child you barely knew, with no expectation of reward or recognition. That kind of character is incredibly rare." He paused, studying her face carefully. "I run a company called Biogenesis Technologies. We're developing new medical treatments and technologies that could revolutionize healthcare. But we've been missing something crucial. People who truly understand what it means to care for patients, not just treat their conditions." End quote. Annie had heard of Biogenesis Technologies, of course. Anyone in the medical field knew about Victor Chen's company and their groundbreaking research. But she couldn't understand why he was talking to her about it. "I want to offer you a position with my company," Victor continued. "Not as a researcher or a lab technician, but as my director of patient care and clinical ethics. Your job would be to ensure that everything we do is guided by the same compassion and dedication you showed last night." Annie stared at him in disbelief. "I'm just a nurse in a small mountain clinic. I don't have the qualifications for that kind of position." "You have the most important qualification. You understand that medicine is about people, not just science." Victor pulled out a folder from his jacket. "I've had my staff prepare a preliminary offer. The salary would be $300,000 per year, plus benefits, stock options, and funding for you to complete any advanced degrees you might want to pursue. You would also oversee a foundation that provides free medical care to underserved communities like this one." The numbers made Annie dizzy. It was more money than she had ever imagined earning. Enough to pay off her student loans, help her parents with their retirement, and still have more left over than she knew what to do with. But more than the money, the opportunity to influence how medical care was delivered on a large scale was incredibly appealing. "Why me?" she asked. "You could hire someone with decades of experience, someone with advanced degrees and prestigious credentials." Victor looked over at Marcus, who was playing quietly with some toy airplanes Rosa had given him. "Because last night, You proved that you understand something that can't be taught in medical school or business school. You understand that every patient is someone's child, someone's family. You understand that sometimes the most important medical intervention isn't a drug or a procedure. It's simply showing up when no one else will. He turned back to Annie. I've spent the last 5 years building a company that creates amazing medical technologies. But I've lost sight of why that matters. Watching you walk through that storm reminded me that medicine is fundamentally about human connection and compassion. I need someone like you to help me remember that as we grow. Annie felt tears welling up in her eyes. The offer was more generous than anything she could have imagined. But beyond the money and the prestige, it represented an opportunity to impact healthcare on a scale she had never dreamed possible. I would need to give notice at the clinic, she said slowly. Dr. Patterson has been good to me, and I'll need time to find a replacement. Victor nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need to transition. And Annie? Part of your role would be establishing a permanent medical facility here in Pine Ridge, staffed with full-time physicians and equipped with modern diagnostic equipment. This community deserves better healthcare than they currently have access to. Tom. Rosa had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement, and now she spoke up. Miss Annie, you must accept this offer. What you did for Marcus, you could do for many more children. This is a gift from God. Annie looked around the small cabin at Marcus playing with his toys, Rosa beaming with pride and gratitude, and Victor waiting patiently for her answer. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been a small-town nurse whose biggest challenge was dealing with supply shortages and equipment breakdowns. Now she was being offered the opportunity to influence healthcare policy and delivery for one of the most innovative medical companies in the world. There's one condition, Annie said finally. I want to continue working directly with patients. I don't want to become so removed from patient care that I lose touch with why this work matters. Victor's smile was genuine and warm. I was hoping you would say that. In fact, I'd like you to help me reconnect with that aspect of medicine as well. I've been behind a desk for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like to actually help someone heal. Annie extended her hand to shake Victor's. Then, I accept your offer. As they shook hands, Marcus looked up from his toys and asked innocently, Uncle Victor, does this mean you're going to visit more often? Victor knelt down beside his nephew again, and his voice was soft but determined. Yes, Marcus. I'm going to visit a lot more often. In fact, I was thinking maybe you and Grandma Rosa might like to come see where I work sometime. It's not far from here, and I have some pretty interesting things to show you. The boy's eyes lit up with excitement. Do you have airplanes at your work? Not airplanes, but I do have helicopters. And computers that can help doctors figure out the best medicine for each person. And laboratories where we're working on treatments for diseases that make children sick. Annie watched the interaction between uncle and nephew, seeing the beginning of a relationship that would clearly be important for both of them. Victor had been changed by witnessing her journey through the storm. But she suspected that reconnecting with Marcus would change him even more profoundly. Over the next few hours, as they waited for the roads to be fully cleared, Victor shared more details about his company and his vision for the future of medicine. He talked about personalized treatments based on individual genetic profiles, about using artificial intelligence to predict and prevent diseases before they became serious, about making cutting-edge medical care accessible to people regardless of their economic status. Annie found herself increasingly excited about the possibilities. Her experience in the small clinic had shown her how many medical problems could be prevented with better access to care and education. The idea of being able to address those issues on a national or even international scale was both thrilling and daunting. When the road crews finally gave the all-clear for vehicle traffic, Victor offered to fly Annie back to town in his helicopter. As they lifted off from the small clearing, Annie looked down at Rosa and Marcus waving goodbye, and felt a profound sense that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The helicopter ride took only 15 minutes, compared to what would have been at least an hour by car on the winding mountain roads. As they approached Pine Ridge, Annie could see the search and rescue teams that had been preparing to look for her, the news vans that had arrived to cover the story of her overnight journey, and the small crowd that had gathered outside the clinic. Dr. Patterson was waiting for her when the helicopter landed in the small parking area behind the clinic. His expression was a mixture of relief, anger, and amazement as he helped her down from the aircraft. "Annie, what were you thinking?" he demanded, though she could see the concern in his eyes. "You could have died out there. I found your note this morning, and I've been worried sick." "I was thinking about a 10-year-old boy who needed medicine," Annie replied simply. "Marcus is going to be fine, by the way." The antibiotics worked perfectly. Dr. Patterson shook his head, but she could see he was fighting back a smile. "You're either the bravest nurse I've ever worked with, or the most foolish." "Probably both." Victor approached them, and Annie made the introductions. Dr. Patterson's eyes widened when he heard Victor's name, clearly recognizing the reputation of Biogenesis Technologies. "Dr. Patterson, I want to discuss some plans for upgrading medical services in this area," Victor said. "Annie has agreed to join my company, but she's also convinced me that communities like Pine Ridge deserve better access to quality health care." Over the next hour, Victor outlined his proposal for establishing a modern medical facility in the area, complete with advanced diagnostic equipment, telemedicine capabilities, and a staff of specialists who could handle more complex cases without requiring patients to travel long distances. Dr. Patterson listened with growing excitement, asking detailed questions about staffing, funding, and timeline. "This would transform healthcare for the entire region," Dr. Patterson said. "We've been struggling with limited resources for years, trying to provide quality care with outdated equipment and understaffed shifts." "Consider it done," Victor replied. "Annie will oversee the project, along with her other responsibilities. I want this facility to be operational within 18 months. As the day progressed, Annie found herself at the center of a media whirlwind she had never expected. Reporters wanted to interview her about her walk through the blizzard. Photographers wanted pictures of her at the clinic, and several national news programs requested remote interviews. Through it all, Victor stayed nearby, helping her navigate the attention and ensuring that the focus remained on the importance of accessible health care rather than sensationalizing her actions. During a brief quiet moment, Annie asked Victor the question that had been bothering her all day. "How did you know so much about my journey through the storm? The reporters are acting like they have detailed information about the whole trip." Victor looked slightly uncomfortable for the first time since she had met him. "I should probably explain that I have security cameras throughout the mountain region. It's part of maintaining privacy and security for my facility. I've been watching the footage of your journey, and I hope you don't mind, but I shared some of it with the media to help tell your story properly." Annie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold weather. "You were watching me the whole time?" "I was concerned about Marcus," Victor said quickly. "He's my nephew, even though I haven't been much of an uncle to him. When I heard he was sick and saw that no official rescue was being attempted, I was monitoring the situation to see if there was anything I could do to help." Annie processed this information, feeling somewhat violated but also understanding Victor's position. "Next time, maybe lead with that information when you're making job offers." Victor nodded sheepishly. "Fair point. I'm still learning how to interact with people normally. I've been isolated for too long." Despite her initial discomfort about being watched without her knowledge, Annie found herself warming to Victor's obvious sincerity and his genuine desire to make amends for his past mistakes. His offer remained incredibly appealing, and she could see the potential for meaningful change in how healthcare was delivered to underserved communities. That evening, after the reporters had finally left and the excitement had died down, Annie sat in her small apartment reviewing the contract Victor's lawyers had prepared. The terms were even more generous than he had initially described, including provisions for continuing education, research, opportunities, and a substantial budget for the patient advocacy programs she would oversee. More importantly, the contract included specific language about maintaining the human element in medical care, ensuring that technological advances never replaced compassionate patient interaction. It was clear that Victor had listened carefully to her concerns about maintaining direct patient contact and had structured the position to honor those priorities. Annie's phone rang, and she was surprised to hear Rosa Chen's voice on the other end. "Miss Annie, I wanted to call and thank you again for what you did. Marcus is completely back to normal, running around and asking when he can see his Uncle Victor again." "I'm so glad he's feeling better," Annie replied. "And I think it's wonderful that he's getting to know his uncle." Rose's voice became more serious. "Victor told me about the job he offered you. I think you should know that Marcus's parents would be very proud of what you did, and very happy that their son brought his uncle back to the family. Sometimes, God uses children to teach adults what really matters." After they hung up, Annie sat quietly for a long time, thinking about the events of the past 24 hours and the decision she was about to make. Her simple act of walking through a snowstorm to help a sick child had somehow created ripples that would affect not just her own life, but the lives of countless patients who would benefit from improved healthcare access and the renewed focus on compassionate care that Victor seemed committed to implementing. She thought about her father's words, the one she had remembered during her difficult journey through the storm. "The mountain will test you, but it will also teach you what you're really made of." The blizzard had tested her physical endurance and mental resolve, but the aftermath was testing something deeper, her willingness to step outside her comfort zone and take on challenges that could help people on a much larger scale. The next morning, Annie called Victor to confirm her acceptance of the position and discuss the timeline for her transition. They agreed that she would work with Dr. Patterson over the next month to ensure a smooth handoff of her current responsibilities, while simultaneously beginning to work on the plans for the new medical facility and her orientation with biogenesis technologies. "There's something else I want to discuss," Victor said during their conversation. "I'd like you to be present when we announce the new medical facility to the community. Your story has captured people's attention, and I think having you involved in the announcement will help people understand our commitment to putting patients first." Annie agreed, though she was still uncomfortable with the level of public attention her actions had generated. She had never sought recognition for doing her job, and the idea of being in the spotlight felt strange and somewhat overwhelming. A week later, the community meeting was held in the Pine Ridge High School gymnasium, the only space large enough to accommodate all the people who wanted to hear about the proposed medical facility. Annie was amazed to see not just local residents, but also people from neighboring communities, healthcare professionals from throughout the region, and even some state officials who had driven up from Denver. Victor's presentation was impressive and detailed, covering everything from the advanced diagnostic equipment that would be available to the telemedicine capabilities that would connect local patients with specialists around the world. He explained how the facility would be staffed around the clock, with emergency capabilities that could handle everything from heart attacks to complicated births without requiring dangerous transfers to distant hospitals. "But technology alone doesn't make great healthcare," Victor said, gesturing toward Annie, who was sitting in the front row. "What makes great healthcare is having people who are willing to go the extra mile, literally and figuratively, to ensure that every patient receives the care they need." Annie Keene demonstrated that commitment when she walked 12 miles through a blizzard to save my nephew. "Now I want to build a healthcare system that embodies that same level of dedication." End quote. The audience erupted in applause, and Annie felt her face burning with embarrassment and pride. She had never expected her actions to lead to such far-reaching consequences, but as she looked around the gymnasium at the faces of her neighbors and colleagues, she could see the hope and excitement that Victor's proposal had generated. During the question-and-answer session that followed, Annie was struck by how many people shared stories of medical emergencies that had been complicated by the region's isolation and limited resources. A rancher talked about his wife going into premature labor during a snowstorm, requiring a dangerous helicopter evacuation that might not have been necessary with better local facilities. The teacher described watching her elderly mother suffer for hours during a heart attack because the nearest cardiologist was 2 hours away on a good day. "This facility would have saved my mother's life," the teacher said, tears in her eyes. "She died waiting for an ambulance that couldn't get through because of road conditions." Victor listened to each story with obvious emotion, and Annie could see that he was genuinely affected by the human cost of inadequate healthcare access. When the formal presentation ended, people crowded around both of them, expressing gratitude and asking more detailed questions about timeline and services. An elderly man approached Annie with particular intensity. "Miss, I want to thank you for what you did for the Chen boy. My grandson has asthma, and I've worried many nights about what would happen if he had a bad attack during a storm like that one. Knowing that there are people like you willing to risk everything to help, it gives an old man some peace of mind." Annie shook his hand warmly. "Soon you won't have to worry about that. The new facility will have all the equipment and medications needed to handle asthma emergencies, plus specialists who can help manage his condition better." As the evening wound down, Victor pulled Annie aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know that tonight convinced me we're doing the right thing. Seeing how this community has been affected by limited healthcare access, listening to their stories, it's made me realize how disconnected I've become from the real-world impact of medical care." End quote. Annie nodded. "It's easy to focus on the science and the business side when you're not seeing patients every day. But ultimately, all of our work comes down to individual people with families who love them and need them to be healthy." "I have a confession," Victor said quietly. "When I first watched the footage of your walk through the storm, I was impressed by your determination and courage. But I was thinking about it primarily as a business opportunity, a chance to recruit someone with exceptional character for my company. Tonight, listening to these stories, I understand that this is about much more than business. This is about responsibility." Over the following months, Annie threw herself into her new role with the same dedication she had shown during her midnight journey through the blizzard. She split her time between Biogenesis Technologies' main campus, where she worked with research teams to ensure that patient perspectives were incorporated into every stage of drug development, and Pine Ridge, where she oversaw the construction and planning of the new medical facility. The contrast between the two environments was striking. At Biogenesis headquarters, she worked in gleaming laboratories with equipment worth millions of dollars, collaborating with some of the brightest minds in medical research. At Pine Ridge, she worked in a construction trailer, coordinating with contractors and medical equipment suppliers to build something that would serve the practical needs of a rural community. But Annie found that both aspects of her work informed and strengthened the other. Her experience in the research environment gave her insights into cutting-edge treatments that could be made available to rural patients through telemedicine. Her ongoing connection to Pine Ridge kept her grounded in the reality of what patients actually needed, rather than getting caught up in theoretical possibilities. Victor proved to be a demanding but supportive boss, pushing Annie to think bigger and more systematically about healthcare delivery, while respecting her insistence on maintaining direct patient contact. He also followed through on his promise to reconnect with his family, visiting Marcus and Rosa regularly, and gradually building the relationship with his nephew that should have existed all along. "Uncle Victor taught me about DNA today," Marcus announced proudly during one of Annie's visits to check on the facility construction. "He says that's how doctors can make medicine that works just for me, not for everybody else." Rosa beamed with pride as she watched Victor and Marcus working together on a simple science experiment. "He's a different man than he was 6 months ago," she told Annie quietly. "Marcus has been good for him, but I think you have been good for him too. You reminded him why his work matters." Annie was touched by the observation, but she was also aware that Victor had been equally transformative for her. Working at Biogenesis had exposed her to possibilities she had never imagined, ways that technology and human compassion could work together to solve healthcare problems on a global scale. One particularly meaningful project involved developing a portable diagnostic system that could be deployed in remote areas around the world. Annie worked with the engineering team to ensure that the system was not just technically sophisticated, but also intuitive enough for healthcare workers with limited training to use effectively. "We're not just building a machine," she explained to the team during one of their planning sessions. "We're building something that will allow a nurse in rural Africa or a paramedic in Alaska to provide the same quality of diagnostic care that would be available in a major hospital. But that only works if the human element is designed in from the beginning." The portable diagnostic system became one of Biogenesis's most successful products, not just in terms of revenue, but in terms of actual impact on global health outcomes. Annie received reports from deployment sites around the world, describing how the system had enabled early detection of diseases that would have gone undiagnosed until it was too late for effective treatment. As the 1-year anniversary of her blizzard walk approached, the Pine Ridge Medical Center was finally ready to open. The facility was everything Victor had promised and more. A fully equipped emergency department, diagnostic imaging capabilities, a surgical suite for routine procedures, and telemedicine connections that allowed local doctors to consult with specialists anywhere in the world. Dr. Patterson, who had been appointed as the facility's chief medical officer, conducted Annie on a tour of the completed building. "A year ago, if someone had told me we'd have equipment like this in Pine Ridge, I would have said they were dreaming," he marveled, showing her the MRI machine that had been installed just that morning. "It still feels a little surreal to me too," Annie admitted. "But seeing it actually built, knowing what it's going to mean for people in this community, it makes everything worthwhile." The official opening ceremony was attended by state officials, medical professionals from throughout the region, and most importantly, members of the community who would be served by the new facility. Annie was asked to cut the ribbon, a symbolic honor that she tried to deflect to Dr. Patterson or Victor, but they insisted that her actions had made the entire project possible. As she held the oversized scissors and prepared to cut the ribbon, Annie looked out at the crowd and saw faces that had become familiar over the past year. The rancher whose wife had nearly died during her difficult pregnancy, the teacher whose mother had died waiting for cardiac care, the elderly man who had worried about his grandson's asthma. She also saw Rosa and Marcus, both beaming with pride, and Victor, who was applauding enthusiastically despite his usual discomfort with public events. "A year ago, I made a decision that seemed simple at the time," Annie said into the microphone. "A child needed medicine, and I had the means to get it to him. I had no idea that decision would lead to all of this. But I've learned that sometimes the most important changes start with a single person deciding to do what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous." She cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted in cheers. As people began touring the new facility, Annie found herself standing quietly in the main lobby, watching families explore the different departments and imagining all the lives that would be saved or improved by having access to quality health care. Victor approached her, looking uncharacteristically emotional. "I need to thank you again, Annie. Not just for saving Marcus that night, but for everything that's happened since then. You've changed my company, you've changed this community, and you've definitely changed me." Annie smiled and shook her head. "We've changed each other, Victor. And more importantly, we've built something that will keep changing lives long after we're gone." Marcus ran up to them, his arms full of promotional materials from the various medical equipment vendors who had displays set up in the lobby. "Miss Annie, look at all this cool stuff. Uncle Victor says when I'm older, I can come visit his laboratory and see how they make new medicines." "That sounds like a wonderful plan," Annie replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "Maybe by then you'll be ready to help them figure out how to make even better medicines." As the celebration continued around them, Annie reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a small-town nurse whose biggest challenge was managing supply shortages and equipment failures. Now she was helping to shape the future of medical care delivery, influencing how one of the world's most innovative companies approached patient care and overseeing healthcare improvements that would affect thousands of Keene people. But perhaps most importantly, she had helped a reclusive billionaire remember why his work mattered, and in doing so, had created a legacy that would extend far beyond any single medical breakthrough or business success. The real measure of her impact wouldn't be found in the financial reports or scientific publications that would result from her work with biogenesis, but in the lives that would be saved by healthcare workers who were inspired to go the extra mile for their patients. As the evening drew to a close, and the crowd began to disperse, Annie walked out to the parking lot and looked up at the mountains that surrounded Pine Ridge. Somewhere up there was the trail she had followed through the blizzard, the path that had seemed so treacherous and uncertain in the darkness, but it ultimately led to more positive change than she could have imagined. The mountains stood silent and majestic in the moonlight, holding their secrets and their challenges, ready to test and teach the next person brave enough to venture into the storm. Annie smiled and headed home, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference, but confident that she was exactly where she was meant to be. 3 years later, Annie received a letter that would become one of her most treasured possessions. It was from a young woman in Kenya who had been diagnosed with a rare genetic condition using the portable diagnostic system that Annie had helped develop. The early diagnosis had allowed for treatment that saved the woman's life and enabled her to complete her medical training. I am writing to thank you, the letter said. Not just for the technology that saved my life, but for the philosophy behind it. I have learned about your walk through the blizzard, and how that led to a focus on putting patients first in medical innovation. Because of you, I was able to become a doctor myself. And I promise to carry forward the same commitment to caring for others that you demonstrated that night. Sometimes one person's courage creates ripples that spread farther than they can ever imagine. Annie folded the letter carefully and placed it in a special box where she kept the most meaningful correspondence from her work. Outside her window, she could see the Pine Ridge Medical Center, busy with the constant flow of patients and families who no longer had to choose between risking dangerous travel for medical care or going without treatment entirely. Marcus, now 13, and more interested in genetics than airplanes, was spending the summer working as a volunteer at the medical center, helping with patient intake and learning about different medical specialties. His relationship with his uncle Victor had grown strong and close, and both of them had been transformed by the connection that Annie's midnight journey had made possible. The story of the nurse who walked 12 miles through a blizzard had become part of local legend, told and retold in the community as an example of what one person could accomplish with determination and compassion. But for Annie, the real story wasn't about her solitary journey through the storm. It was about what happened afterward, the way that single act of caring had created a network of positive change that continued to expand, and grow. As she prepared for another day of work, Annie smiled at the thought that somewhere in the world there were people alive and healthy who might not have been if she had decided to wait for morning instead of venturing into the blizzard. The mathematics of compassion were impossible to calculate, but the results were undeniable, visible in every life saved, every family kept together, every child who would grow up in a world with better access to the medical care they deserved. The storm had tested her and taught her what she was truly made of. But more than that, it had shown her that the most important journeys often begin with a single step into the unknown, taken not because the path is clear, but because someone needs help and you have the power to provide it.